behavior. In order to reach the masses, he had to be looking and acting and living like a peasant, to be in communion with the needs of the peasants.
Ho and his followers also promoted the notion that he was a lifelong celibate who didn't have time for romance or a family because he was so devoted to his cause. This was a myth.
It's fairly clear now that he had several relationships. Whether they were formal marriages or not is difficult to substantiate because there are no certificates that we can point to. It's quite well established that he had either a Chinese wife or a Chinese concubine when he was in Hong Kong. No one knows at this point what happened to that woman.
If Ho was married when he returned to Vietnam, it was to his cause. He was much more interested in finding the right people to form the nucleus of his movement. One of Ho's best decisions was to enlist the help of a talented young man named Vo Nguyen Yap. Yap had a brilliant military mind and was a born leader. But when Yap and his men first encountered Ho, they didn't know who he was or why they should follow him. Ho told them that he had been trained in Moscow and that he was going to liberate the country by using the proven methods of his hero, Lenin. Yap and his men, and hundreds of others, soon joined Ho.
I never thought of him as a revolutionary as much as an organization man. What he was a genius at was his ability to organize movements, the front organization particularly.
A popular front is simply a group of groups united in a single purpose. Ho brought many of the other Vietnamese nationalist organizations together under his banner. But in order to do this, he had to focus on the issues that would appeal to the broadest possible group. December 7, 1941, Japan bombed the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and then launched an all-out attack against the British and Dutch colonies of Southeast Asia. Within weeks, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and Indonesia had all fallen to the Japanese Empire. The Japanese called off their attack on French Indochina when the local pro-Nazi Vichy colonial administration agreed to collaborate with Japan, Germany's Axis partner.
Ho could very well have said, okay, I will side with the Japanese because they're like Asians. But he came to the conclusion, very wisely, the Japanese are no better than the French. They're both aliens. Neither one of them is going to do us any good.
HoChiMinh traveled to South China. Since the Chinese were also fighting Japan, he believed that he could get some military aid from the nationalist Chinese. To his surprise, he was arrested by the local authorities because he was a communist. Ho was thrown into prison. He kept a journal, writing mostly in the Chinese of his youth, in hopes of converting his captors to his point of view. In one poem he wrote, "My heart travels 1,000 miles toward my native land. Innocent, I have now endured a whole year in prison. Using my tears for ink, I turn my thoughts into verse." Ho's health deteriorated as the months passed. He had to find a way out of prison, or he would never live long enough to liberate Vietnam. HoChiMinh spent 14 months enduring the worst imaginable treatment in prison. As the war worsened for the Chinese, Ho convinced his captors to release him so that he could gather intelligence on the Japanese. He was released in 1943 and walked all the way back to his old base in North Vietnam. His compatriots were stunned. They thought he had died. Once again, he became the leader, He was 53 years old. After the U.S. entered the war against Japan, Ho believed that getting American help was essential to Vietnam's future independence. When an American pilot was shot down in North Vietnam, he was brought all the way back to his base in China by Ho.
And you got to try to imagine this guy. He's wearing sandals and shorts. He's got this wispy beard, and he looks like, you know, he weighs about 85 pounds, and he looks like he'd be blown over with a feather.
Ho offered his services to the commanding officer, General Claire Chennault of the legendary Flying Tigers. Chennault declined the offer, but the Office of Strategic Service, or OSS, America's wartime intelligence service, was interested. They believed that Ho could help them rescue downed pilots, and more important, furnish intelligence information on the Japanese. Ho was accompanied back to his base by an OSS officer, giving credence to his claim that the U.S. was his ally. When the OSS began supplying radios, weapons, and training, it helped establish Ho's HoChiMinh as the preeminent Vietnamese nationalist organization. But once again, Ho's life was in jeopardy.
Ho took to his bed and really seemed very sick, so we sent in a paramedic. And indeed, his report, as best I can remember, was saying, this cadaverous old bag of bones is why he's living, I don't know. But he opened his kit and fed him every antibiotic he had, and Ho recovered.
Ho greatly appreciated the Americans, and he impressed all of them. He not only spoke and wrote in English, but he seemed to understand their culture, too. He had also acquired a very American habit.
He liked to smoke American cigarettes, Philip Morris in particular. But he always carried in his front pocket Vietnamese packets of Vietnamese cigarettes. And then those are the ones that he will offer to the guests.
In August of 1945, 2 atomic bombs brought the war to a rapid conclusion. When Japan surrendered, there was really no one in control of Vietnam. Ho moved quickly into the gap. With General Vo Nguyen Giap leading his guerrilla forces, they took control of the north.
That must have been an electrifying experience for the masses, and they must have felt that this was the moment.
On September 2nd, 1945, nearly 500,000 people attended a huge rally in Hanoi. Ho gave an independence speech that began with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
He quoted directly from Declaration of Independence, and maybe what he was doing was flattering United States so that they could be on his side. He was disarming his opponents by saying that he was not going for Marxist revolution, he was only going for plain, simple independence for his country.
He'd admit to being a communist. He said, you know, my purpose is to free up Indochina. I'm not doing anything different than you did in 1776. You managed to deal with it pretty well, and that's all I'm trying to do now. Do you have any problem with that?
Ho had no illusions about the tenuous nature of Vietnamese independence. In perfect English, he wrote a letter to his OSS contacts stating, "The war is won, but we small and subject countries have no share, or very, very small share, in the victory of freedom and democracy. Probably, if we want to get a sufficient share, we have still to fight." Ho went to Paris in 1946 in hopes of working out a compromise where Vietnam could become autonomous within the French Commonwealth.
I think Ho Chi Minh was trying to postpone the inevitability of armed conflict with France, because I think he was under no illusion that the French would give up without a fight.
Ho's mission to Paris failed. Back in Vietnam, conditions were even worse than they had been before World War II. The French army returned and brutalized the country. As many as 2 million Vietnamese starved to death during a famine, while rice was exported to France. Ho appealed to the